The folding chair sat at the curb where the parade route turned onto Main Street, and the old man in it was already dressed. For a march, he had been told he would not be allowed to walk. 9 in the morning, late October, and the wind off the river carried a cold that found the gaps in every coat. Hollis Tarrant wore his garrison cap squared exactly as he had worn it 70 years before, his medals pinned in a straight line over a heart that a county liability forum had decided was no longer strong enough for 400 yards of asphalt. He held a small American flag against his knee, with a hand that shook, and he watched the assembly point fill with younger men in clean uniforms. And he did not cry, because a man who had carried friends off a frozen ridge in Korea had learned a long time ago where the tears went. Across the street, a man in a faded field coat slowed his truck and saw the old man in the chair, and the German shepherd in the passenger seat lifted its head and went still. That stillness is where this story begins, so stay with it to the end. Because what one stubborn old Marine and one stranger did on a cold morning in a small Ohio town reminded a whole community of something it had quietly forgotten. If stories like this one matter to you, take a moment to subscribe and stay until the last line. The man in the truck was named Beckett, and he had not planned to stop in Adair that morning or any morning. He was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent 2 decades carrying weight that was not theirs, with a weathered face the color of river sand and a short crop of dark hair going gray at the temples. There was a thin, pale scar along the left side of his jaw, and his eyes had the particular flatness of a man who had learned to read a room before he entered it, who counted exits without meaning to, who had not stopped scanning roads and faces in 11 years of trying. He had been a gunnery sergeant. He had driven through Adair only because the county route was closed, and the detour fed him down through the heart of a town he had never seen, and he had stopped at the light on Main, with no intention beyond getting through it. The dog beside him was named Juno. She was a working-line German shepherd, 6 years old, 80 pounds of muscle under a classic tan and black saddle coat, her ears fully erect, and her dark almond eyes fixed on the same point Beckett's were. She wore a plain worn leather collar and no vest, because she was retired now the way Beckett was retired, both of them drifting through a country that no longer had an assignment for them. Juno rarely fixed on a stranger without reason. Beckett had learned to trust that more than he trusted his own first read of a person. He looked where she looked. An old man in a folding chair, in full dress with no place in the line. The light turned green. Beckett did not move. A horn sounded behind him, polite and then less polite, and he pulled the truck to the curb beside a hardware store with a hand-lettered sign and a bin of pumpkins going soft in the cold. He sat there a moment, with his hands on the wheel. He told himself he was only letting the parade pass. He had told himself a great many convenient things over the years, and he was honest enough most days to know it. Juno pressed her nose to the window and made a low sound in her chest that was not a growl. Beckett got out. The cold took him at once, clean and hard, and he zipped the field coat to his throat and crossed Main with the dog at his left knee, close, the way she had walked beside him through places with no names on any map. People were gathering on both sidewalks now, families with travel mugs, a knot of teenagers, a woman selling small flags from a folding table. Nobody paid the old man much attention. He had become a fixture, a thing the town walked past the way you walk past a monument you stopped reading years ago. Beckett stopped a few feet from the chair. The old man looked up, and his eyes were a pale washed blue, sharp under the loose skin, and they moved over Beckett the way a sentry's move, taking the measure of him, finding the way he held his shoulders and the way the dog held her ground. "You served," the old man said. It was not a question. "Marines," Beckett said. "Long time ago. Once is enough." The old man's mouth, a hard, flat line under a white mustache trimmed close, eased by a fraction. "Hollis Tarrant, 1st Marine Division. Chosin, the winter of 1950. He said it plainly, the way another man might name the street he grew up on, and there was no boast in it, only the weight of a fact carried for 70 years. Beckett felt something settle in his chest, a recognition older than either of them. He had known men who carried that cold in them their whole lives, the men who came back from that reservoir, and there were not many of them left now. "Gunnery Sergeant Beckett Shaw," he said. "This is Juno." The dog stepped forward, unhurried, and put her broad head under the old man's trembling hand. Hollis Tarrant looked down at her, and for a moment the parade in the wind and the long humiliation of the morning went somewhere far away, and his hands stopped shaking. "Well," he said softly, "she's got manners." Behind them, a man's voice rose bright and practiced. "Mr. Tarrant, there you are." Beckett turned. Port. Man was crossing from the staging area in a charcoal overcoat that had no business on a small-town curb, fortish, smooth-faced, with the kind of smile that arranged itself before the eyes agreed to it. He carried a clipboard the way some men carry authority they were given rather than earned. Juno's ears came forward and a low current ran through her, and she shifted her body half an inch so that her shoulder was between the man and the old man's chair. "Dale Hargrove," the man said to Beckett, offering the smile and not the hand. "County Veterans Services. I coordinate the honor march." He turned the smile down toward Hollis. "Mr. Tarrant, we've been over this. The route's 400 yards. There's the grade up by the courthouse. And after your spell last spring, the county just can't carry the liability. You understand? We've got you a place of honor right here. Everybody's going to see you. I marched this town when you were not born," Hollis said. His voice did not rise. "I marched it with 2 good legs, and I marched it with one when the other was full of Chinese steel. I do not need a chair, and nobody respects that more than I do." Dell's voice was warm and smooth and entirely closed. "But there are rules now. There's paperwork. If something happened out there, it would be on the county, and frankly, it would be on you. You don't want to make this hard." That phrase, Beckett had heard it before in other mouths, in other coats. "You don't want to make this hard." It was the sound a smooth man made right before the hard part started. "What spell?" Beckett said. Dell looked at him as if a piece of the furniture had spoken. "And you are a friend of his?" Beckett had not planned to say it. It came out level and certain, and Juno leaned a fraction of her weight against his leg, and he understood that he had, without quite deciding to, just stopped being a man passing through. Hollis Tarrant lived 2 streets back from Maine in a narrow house with a sagging porch and a flag bracket by the door. And that afternoon, after the parade had gone by him and around him and left him in his chair like a stone in a stream, Beckett drove him home. The old man had refused the offer twice and accepted it on the third, which Beckett had already learned was the shape of him. Juno rode in the back seat with her chin on the old man's shoulder, and Hollis kept one hand on her the whole way, the tremor in it quieting against her fur. Inside, the house was clean and spare and full of a woman who was no longer there. Her sweater still hung on the hook by the door. Her reading glasses still sat folded on the table beside a chair that faced the window. Hollis saw Beckett see them and did not explain, and Beckett did not ask. because he knew that particular arrangement of a room, the way a house holds its breath around an empty chair. Edith, Hollis said finally, lowering himself into the chair that was not by the window. 51 years. She passed in the spring. Same week as the spell, as he likes to call it. His jaw worked. I stood up too fast at her graveside, and the world tipped and I went down. That is the whole of it. A man of 90 stands up too fast over his wife's grave and stumbles, and a year and a half later they take the parade off him for it. Beckett sat across from him with the dog between them. Who is he? Hargrove came in about 2 years back. Veteran Services used to be a woman named Carol, who knew every name in 3 counties and brought you soup when your knees went. Then the county reorganized, and there were grants, and there was Mr. Hargrove with his clipboard and his rules. Hollis looked toward the window where Edith's glasses sat. There used to be 11 of us in this town who marched. From my war and the ones after. Now there is me. And he has decided I am a liability. Juno rose and crossed the small room and lay down against the old man's feet, with a sigh that emptied her whole body, and she put her head on his slippered foot, and Hollis went quiet and looked down at her for a long moment. "That dog of yours," he said. "She knows something I don't," usually Beckett said. "She doesn't waste it on just anyone." What Beckett meant to do was simple, and it was not at first a war. He meant to get the old man back into the march. 1 man, 1 route, 1 morning a year. It seemed like a thing a person could fix with a phone call and a little patience. He had no idea yet that he had pulled a thread on something larger. The way you tug a single root and feel, 3 feet down, the whole hidden mat of it shift. He started by going to the county building the next morning. He wore a clean shirt, and he left Juno in the truck with the window down, and he sat in a plastic chair outside an office with Del Hargrove's name on the door and waited the way the Marines had taught him to wait, which was completely and without visible cost. When he finally got in, Hargrove was all warmth and regret, and he slid a single sheet across the desk, a liability waiver, and said that, of course, Mr. Sabb, Tarrant could march. The county would never forbid it. It was simply that no insurer would cover a participant of his age with a documented fall, and without coverage the county's hands were tied, and surely a veteran himself could appreciate the importance of doing things by the book. It was a good performance. It was nearly seamless. The only flaw in it was small, and Beckett would not understand its size for another week. As he stood to go, he glanced at the wall behind Hargrove, where framed certificates hung, and at a shelf below them lined with thick black binders, and on the spine of one, in neat printed label tape, he read the words ADIIR, Veterans Relief Fund, and beside it a second binder marked Donor Ledger. Just slightly, just enough to put his body between Beckett and the shelf. A man does not stand between you and a bookshelf for no reason. Juno had taught him that, in her way. People guarded what mattered to them with their bodies before they ever guarded it with words. Veterans Relief Fund, Beckett said. That's something the town gives to. Generously, Hargrove said, and the smile held. But a muscle moved at the corner of his jaw. We do a great deal of good in this community, Mr. Shaw. A great deal that doesn't make the parade. Beckett thanked him and left, and in the truck, Juno was sitting up straight and watching the door he came out of, and she did not relax until they were 2 blocks gone. He should have driven on. He told himself that night, in the motel at the edge of town, with the dog stretched across the foot of the bed, he had a life of not staying, 11 years of it, a pattern worn so deep it felt like the grain of him. He had left a ranch in Montana, because a family there had started to need him. He had left a harbor town in Maine the week a widow had begun setting a place for him at her table. He left places the moment they began to feel like they could hold him, because the last place that had held him had been a childhood home he could no longer bear to enter. And somewhere along the way, leaving had stopped being a choice. He was good at it. It was, perhaps, the only thing he had gotten truly good at since the Corps. Juno lifted her head off the blanket and looked at him in the dark. "I know," he said. He stayed. Over the following week, Beckett learned the town the way he had once learned terrain, slowly and on foot, and the town learned him. He fixed the sagging board on Hollis Terrence porch because it needed fixing and because his hands needed something to do, and a neighbor named Ruth Calloway saw him do it and brought over a casserole and the first thread of the thing he was looking for. Ruth was 62, broad and plain-spoken, with reading glasses on a chain and a way of folding her arms that meant she had decided something. She ran the diner on Main, the Bluebird, and she knew, she said, every old soul in Adair, and she did not care for Del Hargrove. And when Beckett asked her why, she set down the casserole and looked at him a long moment and asked him whether he could keep a thing to himself. "For a living," Beckett said, so she told him. She told him about Orrin Pike, 84, a Vietnam corpsman who had applied to the Veterans Relief Fund for help with a furnace, and been told the fund was depleted that quarter. She told him about a widow named Sefton, whose late husband's name had appeared on a plaque of donors she was certain he had never given a dime to because he had spent the last 4 years of his life unable to recognize his own daughter, let alone write a check. She told him the fund used to hand out small grants every month, a furnace, a wheelchair ramp, a tank of heating oil, and that lately the money seemed to go out in a great public ceremony each year at the Honor March, with photographs and a banner, and the rest of the year the answer to every old man who asked was the same. "Depleted this quarter, check back." "And the march," Beckett said. "He runs the march. He is the march," Ruth said. 2 years now, big banner, big speeches about honoring the fallen. The mayor shakes his hand. The paper runs his picture. She took off her glasses and cleaned them on her apron, which was a thing she did, Beckett would learn, when she was deciding whether to be angry out loud. And every year there are fewer of the old ones in the line and more of his speeches about them. Hollis is near the last of them, and Hollis has a mouth on him, and Hollis remembers when the fund actually paid out. "You ask me, Mr. Shaw, a man like Hollis in that march, talking to that crowd, is the last thing your Mr. Hargrove wants." Juno under the table lifted her head and set it on Beckett's boot, and he felt the old familiar thing move in him, the thing the Corps had honed and grief had buried, the protective anger that he kept on a short military leash. He breathed it down. Anger was not a plan. Evidence was a plan. "I need to see that ledger," he said. He did not break into anything. That was not his way, and it was not, he believed, the way a thing like this was won. The Marines had taught him that a position taken by force could be lost by force, but a position taken by patience and proof could not be argued back. What he did instead was slower and surer. He started writing things down. He went and saw Orrin Pike, who was indeed 84, and indeed cold, in a house where the furnace coughed and quit, and Orrin showed him the letter from the Veterans Relief Fund on county letterhead, regretfully informing him that funds were depleted for the quarter. It was dated in January. Beckett photographed it with the date showing. He went and saw the widow Sefton, who showed him the donor plaque photograph from the previous year's march in the local paper, her husband's name, third from the top, and then showed him a calendar from the memory care facility marking the man's decline, and Beckett photographed both side by side, the dead, generous donor, and the man who had not known his own hands. He sat in Ruth's diner in the mornings with a cup of coffee going cold and a notebook, and he listened, and the old people of Adair, who had been walked past for years the way the town walked past Hollis in his chair, began to come and sit across from him and tell him things. Because the dog lay quiet at his feet, and because he wrote down their names, as if the names mattered. The names mattered. He made sure each of them knew that he had written it down. And every few days he went and sat with Hollis Tarrant and the old man who had refused help his whole life, slowly let himself be helped, which Beckett understood was the hardest marching the man had done in years. Hollis told him about Chosen, a little at a time, never all at once, the cold that froze the morphine and the plasma, the men he carried, the friend named P.T. Voss, whose body he could not bring down off the ridge and whose mother he had written to for 30 years after, until she died. He told it flatly, looking at the window where Edith's glasses sat, and Beckett listened the way he had learned to listen, completely and without flinching, and the dog lay between them and kept her vigil over the old man's feet. "You know why I won't sit in that chair," Hollis said one evening. The light was going amber in the room. "It isn't pride. Folks think it's pride." He turned his pale eyes on Beckett. "Every year there's one less of us. 1 year it'll be none. And the day they put us in chairs at the curb and march around us is the day they decided we were already monuments. I am not a monument yet. I have walked every step of my life, including the ones that cost me. I will not be set at the curb and admired. Do you understand the difference?" "I do," Beckett said, and he did. He had spent 11 years being a man who moved, because the moment you stopped, people started to arrange you into something fixed, something they could walk past. He had run from being set at the curb of his own life. He looked at this old man who would not sit down, and he felt the thing he had been running from finally catch up to him gently, like a hand on the shoulder. Juno rose then and crossed the room, and instead of lying at the old man's feet, she sat directly in front of his chair and leaned her full weight into his knees and looked up at him, and Hollis put both his trembling hands on either side of her head, and the room was very quiet. "She's deciding something," Beckett said. "No," Hollis said she decided a while back. "She's just letting me catch up." The first hard push came on a Thursday. Beckett came back to the motel and found Juno standing stiff-legged at the window of the room, a low sound in her chest, and a county code enforcement notice taped to the door of Hollis Tarrant's house when he drove past it, citing the porch repair he had made without a permit and ordering the work inspected or removed. It was small and it was petty, and it was a message, and the message was clear enough. Hargrove knew Beckett was asking questions. Hargrove was reminding him that a county had 1,000 small ways to make a stranger's life difficult and an old man's life harder. Beckett stood on the porch he had fixed and read the notice twice, and felt the anger come up clean and cold, and he made himself wait until it passed, and then he made a decision that surprised him. He did not go to Hargrove. He went to the diner, and he asked Ruth Calloway to spread the word that on Saturday morning he would be on Hollis Tarrant's porch with coffee and tools, and that anyone in Adair who had ever been told the relief fund was depleted, or who remembered when it was not, was welcome to come and sit a while. He was not sure anyone would come. He had spent 11 years not asking people for anything, and asking felt like stepping off a ledge in the dark. They came. They came slow, and they came stooped, and they came in old coats the way the old come, and by 9 on Saturday there were 19 people on and around the porch of the narrow house, Orrin Pike and the widow Sefton, and a retired schoolteacher and 2 brothers who had served in different wars and not spoken in years. And Ruth, with 3 urns of coffee from the Bluebird, and they sat, and they talked, and the porch Beckett had repaired held all of them. Hollis Terrence sat in the center of it, not at a curb, not set apart, in the middle of his own people, and Juneau moved through the crowd from lap to lap, and the old town that had been walking past itself for years sat down together and remembered that it was a town. Beckett stood at the rail with his coffee and watched it happen, and felt his throat tighten in a way that combat never managed, and grief had only sharpened. He had not built this. He had only stopped, stayed, and written down some names. The thing had been there the whole time, banked like coals under ash, waiting for a breath. What he learned on the porch that Saturday was the piece that turned the whole matter. The retired schoolteacher, a small, fierce woman named Della Voss, sat down beside him near the end and told him quietly that she had kept the books for the Veterans Relief Fund for 11 years before the reorganization, and that the last thing she had done before she handed over the records was make herself a copy of 3 years of the donor ledger and the disbursement log, because 30 years of teaching had taught her that the people most eager to take over the books are sometimes the people you most want a copy of the old ones. She had kept the copies in a hat box in her closet. She had not known what to do with them. She had not been sure anyone would believe an old woman with a hat box. Her last name caught in Beckett's ear before the rest of it did. Voss. He looked at her. "My husband's uncle," she said, reading his face. "Peter Voss, Petey. He died in Korea, in the cold, and his body never came home." Her chin lifted. "Hollis Tarrant wrote to Petey's mother every year for 30 years. I married into a family that knew exactly what that man is worth. So you understand, Mr. Shaw, I have been very angry for 2 years, and I have had a hat box full of the reason, and I have been waiting for someone to write down the names." Juneau came and sat in front of Della Voss and leaned into her, and the old woman put a steady hand on the dog's head and did not weep, and Beckett understood that he had been handed the thing that all his patients had been digging toward. It was not violence that won it, and it was not a confrontation on a courthouse step. It was paper. It was, in the end, the slowest and most ordinary weapon there is, and the most certain. Beckett spent 2 days with Della Voss at her kitchen table, the hat box open between them, laying the old disbursement logs beside the photographs he had taken and the dated letters the old people had kept. The pattern came up out of the numbers the way a shape comes up out of fog. For 11 years the fund had paid out small and often, furnaces and ramps and oil, hundreds of small mercies, names Della could put a face to. Then, 2 years back, the disbursements dropped to almost nothing, while the donations, on paper, climbed. Names appeared on the donor rolls that did not belong there, the widow Sefton's husband among them, men too far gone to give, men already dead. The money came in on paper and went out on paper to a line item labeled Administration and Events, and a smaller share went out to nowhere Della could trace at all. Beckett did not understand every mechanism of it, and he did not need to. He understood enough. A man had taken a thing built to keep old soldiers warm and turned it into a thing that kept his own picture in the paper, and to do it cleanly, he had needed the old soldiers quiet and out of the way, and set at the curb in chairs where the crowd would admire them. Hollis Tarrant, in the march, talking, remembering out loud how the fund used to pay, was the one variable Del Hargrove could not control, So Del Hargrove had taken the march away from him and called it liability. The thing to do with proof is not to shout it. Becket knew that. A man who shouts can be called unstable, can be removed, can be made the story instead of the proof. What you do with proof is place it quietly and completely into the hands of the people whose job it is to act on it, and you do it in a way that cannot be walked back. Delavos knew the county auditor, a careful woman named Pruitt, who had no love for Hargrove and a deep respect for a clean set of books. Ruth Calloway knew the editor of the county paper, who had run Hargrove's photograph 11 times and was beginning, she said, to feel used. And Becket knew how to assemble a thing so that each piece supported the next. The way you build a load so it will not shift on a bad road. They did not move in secret, exactly. They moved carefully, though, and they moved together, and the morning of the honor march, everything was in place. The march that year drew the biggest crowd Adair had seen in a decade, though not for the reason Del Hargrove believed. What had gone quietly through the town the way water goes through a field, person to person, and the people came not only to watch, but to stand. Main Street filled under a hard, bright, cold sky, the maples gone to rust and gold, the river wind sharp enough to redden every face. The banner hung over the courthouse steps, Honor March, and the mayor stood ready and the high school band tuned. And at the staging area, Del Hargrove moved through it, all in his charcoal overcoat with his clipboard, smiling, arranging certain of his morning. He had set a folding chair at the curb at the turn onto Main, with a small reserved placard on it, for Hollis Tarrant. Hollis Tarrant did not go to the chair. He came instead from his own house 2 streets back, walking. He wore his dress blues, brushed and pressed by Ruth and Della the night before, his medals in their straight line, his garrison cap squared, and he walked slowly. And he walked with a cane, and he walked entirely under his own power, and at his left shoulder in a clean field coat with his own service ribbons pinned over his heart, walked Becket Shaw. And at Becket's left knee, close, her tan and black coat brushed to a shine and a small flag clipped to her plain leather collar, walked Juno. Behind them, falling in as they came up the side street and turned onto the route, came the others, Orrin Pike, the widow Sefton, Della Voss, Ruth Calloway with her apron off and her good coat on, the 2 brothers who had not spoken, walking now side by side, 19 of them, then more, the old people of Adair and their children, and the strangers who had heard, falling in behind a 90-year-old man who had been told he could not march until the line that came up Main Street was longer than any Honor March banner had ever flown over. Del Hargrove stepped into the street with his clipboard and his smile fraying at the edges. Mr. Tarrant, we talked about this. The liability, the route. I can't have you out here without coverage. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Hollis stopped. The whole line stopped behind him. He looked at Del Hargrove for a long moment, and the crowd along Main went quiet enough to hear the flags snapping in the wind. "Son," Hollis said, and his voice, though thin, carried clear in the cold. "I have been afraid of exactly 2 things in 90 years, and a parade was never one of them, and neither are you." He started walking again. The line moved with him. Juno did not growl and did not lunge. She did something more telling. As Hargrove stood in the path of the march with his clipboard, the dog walked up to him, unhurried, and stopped in front of him, and looked up at him with her dark, steady eyes, and then she turned, deliberately, and put herself at the old man's side again and walked on. She had taken his measure in front of the whole town, and found nothing in him worth guarding against. There was no clearer verdict she could have given. Hargrove was still standing in the street, the march flowing around him like water around a post, when the county auditor named Pruitt came down the courthouse steps with a folder under her arm and the editor of the paper beside her, and asked him quietly and without drama whether he had a few minutes after the ceremony to discuss some discrepancies in the Relief Fund's disbursement records, going back 2 years, that had been brought to her attention with documentation. She said it low. She did not need it loud. The smile finally left Del Hargrove's face entirely, and what was under it was not menace and was not charm. It was the small gray fear of a man who has heard a door close that he cannot open again. He did not march. He did not make a speech. By the following spring he had resigned the position and left the county, quietly, the way such men leave, never quite facing the thing directly, slipping out a side door before the accounting was fully read into the public record. There was an inquiry. There were repayments ordered. Carol, the woman who used to bring soup when your knees went, was asked to come back and help set the fund right. And she did, and the furnaces got fixed again, or in Pike's among the first. None of that was the morning, though. The morning was an old man walking up his own main street, under his own power, with a town at his back, and it belonged to him. Hollis Tarrant marched the full 400 yards. He marched up the grade by the courthouse that the liability form had decided would kill him, slowly, the cane finding each foot of ground, Beckett at his shoulder ready to catch him, and never once needing to, and the dog at his side, and the town behind. At the top, where the route ended at the War Memorial, a plain granite stone with too many names on it, Hollis stopped and stood as straight as 90 years would let him stand, and he raised his trembling hand to the stone in a salute he held until his arm shook, and he said a name out loud that only Beckett was close enough to hear. "Petey," he said. "I made it up the hill. Took me a while." And then the old man's hard, flat mouth moved, and a thing happened that Ruth Calloway said afterward she had not seen in the 20 years she had known him. Hollis Tarrant wept, standing at the memorial openly and without shame, an old soldier finally setting down a weight he had carried up a frozen ridge 70 years before and never once let go of. And Delavos took one of his hands, and Beckett took the other, and Juno leaned against his legs to hold him up. And the whole town stood in the cold and let him. Beckett did not leave Adair. He noticed at first the way you notice weather changing, not as a decision, but as a fact that had already settled. The motel manager mentioned a small rental house coming open on the street behind Main, a porch that needed work, a yard a dog would like. Ruth started keeping a particular mug behind the diner counter that nobody else was allowed to use. Hollis Tarrant began saying, "When you come Tuesday instead of if," and Beckett began coming Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays after, and the pattern that had been leaving for 11 years quietly became a pattern of staying without his ever standing. He simply found, one ordinary morning, that he had nowhere he was running to and no longer felt the pull, and that the absence of the pull did not frighten him. He took the rental house. He fixed the porch. Juno claimed the yard and a particular patch of afternoon sun on the kitchen floor. And she slept now without one ear always turned to the door, which Beckett noticed before he noticed it in himself. On Tuesdays, he sat with Hollis Tarrant in the spare, clean house, with Edith's glasses still on the table, and they did not always talk, and that was all right. Sometimes Beckett fixed a thing that needed fixing. Sometimes Hollis told another small piece of the cold winter of 1950, and Beckett held it for him, the way you hold a thing for a man whose hands have started to shake. The old man taught him to play cribbage, and beat him steadily and without mercy. The dog lay between them through the long afternoons, and grew gray at her own muzzle, slowly, the way they all were, and was content. Hollis Tarrant marched the next year too, and the year after. Each year slower, each year with Becket at his shoulder and the dog at his side and the town behind, and the chair at the curb was put away in a county closet and not brought out again, because a town that has remembered something does not easily forget it twice. And when, in the fullness of time, Hollis did not march again, because no man marches forever, and 90 years had finally become enough, the town carried his name up the hill and set it on the granite stone beside Petey Voss and all the others, and Becket walked up the grade by the courthouse one more time with a gray-muzzled dog at his knee. And he did not run from the grief of it, and he did not leave the town, because he had finally learned the thing the old man had spent his last good years teaching him without ever once saying it plainly. You do not let them set you at the curb. You walk every step you are given, including the ones that cost you, and you walk beside the ones who can no longer walk alone, and that, in the end, is the whole of it. If you have ever felt yourself become a thing the world walks past, a person set quietly at the curb of your own life, and admired and not heard, I want you to remember this old man and the stranger who stopped at a green light he had no reason to stop at. None of us is meant to be a monument while we still draw breath. Every one of us is meant to be walked beside. There is always someone who can still take a step, and there is always someone who can walk beside them, and the deciding to stop and stay and offer your shoulder is the nearest thing to grace that ordinary people are given to do for one another. Be the one who stops at the light. Be the one who walks beside. And if no one has walked beside you in a long while, hold on, and keep your metals straight and watch the road, because sometimes a stranger and a good dog come down a closed county route on a cold October morning, looking for nothing, and find you. May God keep you and the ones you love. May He set good people in your path and make you good in someone else's, and may you never be left alone at the curb. Walk well and stay until the end of every march that is yours to walk.